you're going to be late.
Yes, because there's a...
Yeah. They just rang me.
All right then. So did you get on?
No worries.
Okay.
Whatever happens.
That's correct. It's 30 minutes, so everyone will get the constituency statement, regardless of division.
Good to be here.
Tracy and me. It's like that, isn't it? I've missed the first 2 minutes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tracy's not here. Yeah. Tracy's not here first.
Yes,
Yeah, Ms. Clayton.
Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Good morning. Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Last March, I stood in this place and I said that I felt we were facing a tsunami with respect to housing security and housing affordability. A year ago, during Homeless Week 2021, I called on all governments, state, federal and local, to work together to ensure we have the resources for affordable housing to help address homelessness through increasing rental allowance, a national housing strategy and more federal support for social housing. And I therefore welcome the government's commitment to develop a new national housing and homelessness plan to the tune of $10 billion, known as the Housing Australia Future Fund for Social and Affordable Housing. And I really want to know what this will mean for our regions. Yesterday, I met with Homelessness Australia, the Community Housing Industry Association and National Shelter to discuss their theme for this week's homelessness, which was to end homelessness. We need a plan. Together we reflected on this theme and the need for any plan to tackle homelessness needs to recognise the special challenges the provision of social and affordable housing means for non-metropolitan areas. Mayo, like many electorates, is suffering from a lack of affordable housing, and this is leaving many of my constituents couch surfing, rough sleeping, and even, sadly, I have seen tents behind one of our local churches. This lack of affordable housing is preventing areas like the Fleurieu and Kangaroo Island from attracting new workers because there's simply nowhere for people to live if they get a job. Yesterday, I discussed with Homelessness Australia and CHIA and National Housing that we need to work together on all levels. This is a problem that affects all three levels of government, and a solution can only be found if we all work together. I believe that if we need to do more to incentivise investor involvement, and the Future Fund could be further boosted if we somehow come up with a plan that can also allow mum and dad investors to be part of this solution. Smart measures can be implemented to mitigate the loss of affordable housing due to ageing out of the NRAS system, and perhaps we could even stretch those last NRAS properties. I know many in my community, the rents, they've come off the NRAS system, the rents have gone up and people can no longer afford to stay in there. We need to keep every possible housing stock we can. I'm glad that there is now a commitment by the federal government to invest in social and affordable housing. I think we can all work through this together because everybody deserves a place to call home. Thank you.
Thanks. And I give the call to member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to rise today to speak as the member for Isaacs, as I now enter my 6th term in this parliament. My first and most important duty is as the member for Isaacs. As we learned at the last election from some high-profile examples in my home state of Victoria, the privilege of being re-elected by your constituents can never, ever be taken for granted. Every election is hard work and every victory is hard won. My job was made easier by those who dedicated so much time and effort during the campaign to keeping Isaacs in Labor hands. To the hard-working and tireless volunteers who stood with me at pre-poll for many hours, who knocked on doors and made countless phone calls, thank you. You are the lifeblood of our party and you are also great company. To my electorate staff who support me not just during campaigns but do vital work every day to help constituents, thank you. I could not do this without you. Those many hours at pre-poll were full of interesting and engaging conversations with voters. Many were ready for change and tired of the old excuses of the former Morrison government. Many were cynical that things would never change. To those people, I want to say this: whether or not you voted for me, the new Albanese Labor government will deliver change for the better. We are a government which will listen. We are a government which will deliver on our promises. When things go wrong, we will not make excuses. We will be honest and frank as the Australian people deserve. We will fight every day for you. We promised a better future, and I truly believe better days lie ahead. To the people of Isaacs, thank you for voting for me once more, and for putting your trust in me. It's an honour to once more represent you in this place.
Thank you. The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I recently had the privilege of attending the Australian Defence Force Parliamentary Exchange Program over in Hawaii. And if members haven't heard about the ADF Parliamentary Exchange Program, please do yourself a favour, because it is not only a most amazing experience, but you actually get to see what our men and women in our defence forces do. So both myself and Senator Raf Ciccone travelled to Hawaii and participated and observed in the RIMPAC, or the Rim of the Pacific exercises, which included 26 nations around the world. And the concept was the interoperability between all of those nations to show that force together for our own sovereignty and the sovereignty of our allies. But it wasn't just observing, it was actually doing, Deputy Speaker, and it was, I have to say, an experience emptying out the garbage bags in the holds of the HMAS Canberra, where we spent 3 nights on, in addition to participating in exercises for emergency management, all the way up to high-level briefings with the captain of the HMAS Canberra for 3 days. We then spent 2 days with the Amphibious Unit 2 RAR on the coastline of Hawaii, watching these extraordinary human beings carry out incredible feats, jumping out of helicopters, inflating inflatable life rafts out at seas, putting on double-engine outboards and operating back into sea. I had the pleasure of meeting Navy diver William Sharkey, whose parents both live in Bellingen in my electorate, and I'd like to thank him and his colleagues for their hospitality and showing me around their unit, and also to Navy Lieutenant Chris Peterson, part of the disaster response on board HMAS Canberra. What I can say is, having observed 26 nations, there is little doubt that the Australian Defence Force is one of the best in the world. And I would like to thank all servicemen and women and former servicemen and women for your service to this country and for the freedoms that we enjoy today. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, and I give the call to the member for Franklin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And this is my first opportunity to put on the record here in this place my sincere thanks and gratitude to the wonderful people of the electorate of Franklin for sending me back here to this place and for their vote of confidence in me. It has been an extraordinary year, and the people of Franklin currently in Hobart, we're going through another wave of COVID, and it has been raised as a serious concern with locals raising this issue with me. But throughout the campaign, they also raised a whole range of ideas and concerns with me, particularly around rising costs of living, about access to healthcare, and also about affordable housing. So I'm really thrilled to be part of the new Albanese Labor government, but also to be Minister for Housing and Homelessness and Minister for Small Business. And as the people of Franklin would know, I am hardworking and committed, and I am absolutely committed to delivering on Federal Labor's election commitments when it comes to housing, homelessness and small business, particularly around housing affordability, Deputy Speaker. It is a really serious issue in my hometown of Hobart. Hobart has some of the lowest vacancy rates and some of the highest rental increases. We've also had some of the highest property increases. And it is becoming truly unaffordable for most people to be able to get into the housing market and to be able to put a roof over their head and to find a safe place to call home. Indeed, over the last 12 months, I've really had an extraordinary number, even prior to having this portfolio, of people coming into my electorate office at risk of homelessness, trying to get accommodation and somewhere for them and their children to stay. But I'm really thrilled to be part of a government that also made some very significant commitments to my electorate. $60 million upgrade to the Hobart Airport will be changing for the Hobart economy. This will allow exporters out of Hobart to have wide-body aircraft on the Hobart runway. It is the only airport in Tasmania capable of doing this, and it will allow our fresh produce that our producers in Tasmania are so good at to get to the rest of the world faster. You know, whether we're talking about crayfish or abalone or salmon or, you know, some amazing produce coming out of my home state, cherries and berries and all sorts of wonderful things that we want to get to markets overseas much faster, and this upgrade will create a significant number of jobs in my home state of Tasmania. We also made a commitment to Clarence Headspace, more mental health services in my electorate, which I'm absolutely committed to. Another thing that we did was we committed $20 million to increasing ferry services for public transport on the Derwent River, which will help with some of the congestion and some of the traffic issues in Hobart. There has been a ferry trial being run by the state government that has been incredibly successful, and so I'm really pleased that we've made this commitment around infrastructure to allow more ferries across the Derwent, and I look forward to delivering for the people of Franklin.
Thank you. I'm giving the call to somebody from the opposition, presumably.
Thank you very much.
Member for Grey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm actually filling in for the leader, and I didn't recognise the name as such. I'm taking the opportunity to add to my comments of last night on the cashless debit card and its roll-up. I said at the time I thought it was pretty sad that the government's first urgent bill that it had to get through the parliament was the cashless debit card, which will of course give more money to gamblers, chronic alcoholics and drug addicts. And that I had more to say. And I thank Minister Rishworth for coming to Ceduna, but I was disappointed with the fact that she came there on a mission, which was to shut down the card, not to find out whether the card worked on a first visit to Ceduna. But she did meet with the Far West Indigenous Leaders Community Council and with the council, and I sat in on that meeting. I also told her when I had an opportunity to speak that she and the government will be held responsible for whatever the outcome is, and they should be prepared for that. On the back of the fact that the state coroner found that there were 7 individuals died in Ceduna owing to alcohol abuse, which led to a raft of changes in the town. And I can tell you, Ceduna community is a vastly changed place to what it was 7 or 8 years ago, when we had bars up on windows, high levels of graffiti and attacks on property throughout the community. It's a much more peaceful and civilised place at this time. And I largely put that down to the card. And when I'm speaking of the government responsibility here, the former Mayor, Alan Suter, who was a champion of this card, in fact, we worked together to bring in firstly the basics card and then the cashless debit card to Ceduna. I asked him, I said, well, is there something you would like to say? And he said, the PM and responsible ministers will be held responsible, especially for what happens to women and children in community. I was speaking recently to a friend from Ceduna who had been in Katherine and Tennant Creek, and they were horrified by what they saw there. And they said, there but for the cashless debit card, go we. Yeah. If things go pear-shaped in Ceduna, and I hope they don't, because I don't want my community all smashed up. But if they do in Ceduna, my question is, what will the minister do? What will the government do to address those problems? Extra police? Is the federal government going to fund extra police? Are they going to fund night patrols? Are they going to fund community constables? What is it they're going to do? And given the track record of all of those things of actually getting rid of this type of antisocial behaviour, I wish them luck. So we are approaching the time when we're going to find out in real time just what good job the cashless debit card is doing.
Thank you. Time's expired. I give the call to member for Shortland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'll take this opportunity to congratulate you on your election to your role. Well done. I'm sure you'll do brilliantly as you've already started to perform. Deputy Speaker, I've served in the House for almost a decade, and whenever I've made a contribution on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, it has been to highlight the woeful administration and vicious, cruel and callous cuts made by the previous Liberal government. In the last few months of the Morrison government, 220 participants were having their funding slashed by 20% or more every day, each and every day, Deputy Speaker. This is a shocking indictment of those opposite and how we as a nation look after some of the most vulnerable people in our community. So it's good to recognise that the Albanese government has reacted swiftly to address these shocking cuts and appalling review process participants have to contend with. I commend the Minister for the NDIS for establishing the alternate dispute resolution scheme that will hopefully spare participants and their families and carers the inconvenience and, in many cases, the trauma of having to appeal to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. I want to draw to the attention of the House the experience of a particularly vulnerable constituent of mine who is suffering because of the cuts to her plan. Vicky from Spears Point was born blind and has congenital rubella syndrome. Over the past few years, her hearing has deteriorated to a point that she can no longer hear without hearing aids, and even with hearing aids she has difficulty. All medical evidence provided to the agency indicate Vicky requires more support. However, in their wisdom, they've actually cut Vicky's funding. This is a highly at-risk participant who is blind and deaf and who requires significant assistance, and the NDIS have cut the much-needed support she has at a time when she's actually requiring more assistance. Deputy Speaker, Vicky and her carer are now enduring the internal review process, and I can tell the House I've never come across an internal review at the NDIS that has changed the original decision. And if the decision is upheld, they will have to go to the AAT. This is wrong, and that is why the new mechanism being introduced by the government is so sorely needed. It's often said that a mark of a civilised society is how they treat their most vulnerable. Well, on this test, the way the NDIS has been cutting participants' plans, we are failing. People with disability and their families and carers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect and should not have to justify over and over again to bureaucrats why support is necessary. The NDIS is one of the proud Labor legacies, along with Medicare, compulsory superannuation and needs-based school funding, that I'm so proud of. The Coalition trashed the system during their decade in office, and that's why I'm so proud that the Albanese government is enacting much-needed change to ensure people with disability get the care they deserve.
Thank you. Give the call to Member for Calare.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to pay tribute to the brilliant members of the Bathurst community whose names have been etched into the city scrolls. These citizens have been recognised by Bathurst Regional Council as living legends, humble heroes who tirelessly serve and support their community. They don't wear capes, but they are true community champions, determined to build a better city, create a brighter future, or simply bring about a lasting smile on the faces of those in our local community. From Dunkeld to Keppel Street to Kelso and everywhere in between, they demonstrate what counts in life is what we do for others, and they strive mightily to make Bathurst and its surrounding region the best place it can be. On the weekend, I was thrilled to attend a special presentation honouring the city's living legends from the past 3 years, like Arthur Davis, who received legendary status in 2020. Mr Davis's love of rally car racing saw him compete in the 1977 London to Sydney Marathon, the longest car rally in history. Covering 3 continents and 30,000 kilometres, he would call into 2BS to update Bathurst on how he was tracking. He eventually combined his love of getting behind the wheel with charity, running the Kidney Car Rally for 17 years with his wife Kim to raise vital funds for kids and young people with kidney disease. Other amazing living legends from 2020 were George Gale, David Pinnells, Jeffrey Porter, Jane Rawlings and Lachlan Rendell. In 2021, Amanda Wilding became a Bathurst living legend. Ms Wilding has been volunteering at Daffodil Cottage Wig Library since it opened more than 8 years ago, stocking more than 250 wigs. Amanda assists people undergoing treatment for cancer or who are suffering hair loss to feel like themselves again through finding the perfect new do. Other recipients in 2021 were Sula Aspros, Margaret Bauer, Doug Coates, Royce George and Anne Llewellyn. This year, 6 Bathurst citizens were recognised: Lynn Cooper, Maureen Markwick, Gloria Packham, Terry Roberts, Paul Smith and Sister Mary Comer, who in 1988 founded Centrecare Bathurst, where families could seek counselling in country New South Wales. To this day, the centre provides social welfare services to children and families across the Western region. Congratulations to the Bathurst living legends. Your perseverance, courage and kindness leaves a legacy we can all look up to.
Thank you. I give the call to the member for Pearce.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I congratulate you on your role. Today I rise for my constituent statement to not only congratulate an outstanding member of my community, but to shine a light on his achievements and his accomplishments. Members of this place may recall the name Jai Hindley, who won the Giro d'Italia in 2022, just a few months ago. Jai had a passion for cycling since he was a little boy and has competed in cycling competitions his whole life. Jai has been travelling overseas for cycling competitions since he was 15. This perseverance and dedication led him to become an Aussie legend and the first Australian to win the Giro d'Italia. We are so incredibly proud of him. Pearce is fortunate enough to be the home to Jai and his family, and I would like to take this time to provide the Chamber and the Australian people with some further information about Jai and what makes him so great. Jai can be described as caring and thoughtful, confident and easygoing. Family is important to him. He has a determined dedication to learning and striving for the next level in his development. However, Jai never forgets the beauty of our electorate and looks forward to coming home to all things Australian and spending time by the ocean in Mindarie. Jai not only grew up in Pearce, but was born in Pearce before moving overseas to live at the age of 18. And Jai attended the Mindarie Primary School, the Peter Moyes Anglican Community School, of which I was Foundation Registrar. And I met Jai's family during this time. Jai later went on to study at the Mindarie Senior College, of which I'm a board member. And I'm sure all of these local schools are proud to list him as an alumni. We all know that with great achievements comes great sacrifice and a lot of hard work. Jai juggled school and also trained 4 times a week at the Midland Velodrome, in summer and in winter. He would road train in the Perth Hills during the early mornings before the heat of the day. Jai would train on the bike 6 days a week with a 5 a.m. start each day before school. He would ride to training, train and then ride home. For a young person to have such dedication and perseverance is nothing short of outstanding. I'd like to share a mantra of Jai's in the hope that it influences other aspiring sports champions. Jai's mantra is, ride hard, train harder, go hard or go home. All of the hard work Jai has put in has paid off. He competed in the Midland Cycling Club events on track and on road from the age of 6. He competed interstate from under 18 age groups. He won the national championships. He competed in the World Championships in the under-19s age group and then spent a season racing in Italy, where he just turned 18 with an Italian team. And that's where Jai learned a lot about European terrain and racing. The next few years saw Jai selected in Australian World Tour Academy based in Italy.
Time's expired and I give the call to the member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to pay tribute to a great member of the Casey community who passed away in May this year, David Horner. David was a life member of the Hillsville Cricket Club, but he was a husband to Robin and a father to Tom and Nick, and he was also a friend of mine. Dave was influential in our community in Hillsville of saving the Hillsville Cricket Club 20 years ago when it was on its knees. He put in time, dedication, financial resources to support the club so it could continue to be a great place in the community, supporting young men and women. Dave was a larger-than-life character, and that was shown at his funeral just 5 weeks ago, when it was standing room only and great stories were shared about a man that loved his family, loved his community, loved fishing and a beer. He was a humble man, but he was a great man as well. Dave played a huge influence on my life when I was a young man, supporting me through my challenges and providing that fatherly wisdom that a senior person at a sports club can when you listen to them and not your family. And his funeral was a tribute to the man that he is and the influence he had on his community. Dave was struck down with cancer 12 months ago, and it was a shock to a lot of us, but I was fortunate during the campaign to run into Dave at the Terminus Hotel, where he and the Table of Knowledge were discussing the world's problems. And what struck me was, despite the challenges that he had and knowing the fate that he would have, Dave didn't change. The smile was there, the humour was there, the love for his friends and family was there, and I was so honoured that I could run into him on the campaign and spend some time talking to him, sharing our journey together. And what will stay with me is the pride that Dave had in myself and others in representing our community, and the joy that I saw it had. So I was overwhelmed that he was with us on election day so he could see the result. And I just wanted to put on the record my thanks to David Horner for the support that he provided to myself as a young man to help me be here today, the support he's provided to many young people in our community over his amazing journey, not just at the Hillsville Cricket Club, but the time he spent at the Seville Cricket Club. And in many ways, Dave Horner represents what community spirit is all about. Looking after your friends, looking after your family, looking after your community for no reason other than to help people enjoy their lives.
Thank you. Just before I give you the call, Member, I do want to acknowledge Mr Ozzie Cruz, an elder of the Yuin Nation. I must say, as a young woman, having grown up in Bermagui, I got to live on your country, and I also want to welcome the students from one of the great schools at Pambula Beach, I understand. So on that note, I give the call to the member for Eden Monaro.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it is my pleasure today to rise and deliver a speech written for me by representatives of Lumen Christi Catholic College who are present in the chamber today, and a big shout out for you guys for travelling 3 hours and leaving very early in the morning to get here, and a big thank you to Uncle Ozzie Cruz for coming along as well. Uncle Ozzie is well known to many people across this Parliament. He's well known to most people in our area and is a much respected elder of our community. The students and staff of Lumen Christi Catholic College acknowledge the First Nations people of Yuin Country in our local region of the Bega Valley Shire. Lumen supports reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians through our support of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. In response to the Uluru Statement, the school embarked on a journey to build awareness of the Uluru aims, and they hope that the many voices from nations across Australia will be heard. So in their college, they sought to bring together a choir of voices, encouraging Makarrata, truth-telling and a voice to Parliament. Today, the college and its community present a collaborative artwork, and I table this on their behalf to Parliament. Which is a document called From the Heart, the story of its creation to Parliament. The 2020 project sparked by passionate discussions between the social justice advocates of the far south coast and Lumen Christi Social Justice Advocates Group, which aims to raise awareness and support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and staff working together illustrated aspects of local culture. Each corner represents in local language Baringa, the light, Monaroo, the people, Gadu, the waters, and Bobbara, the mountains. They are also the names of the 4 college houses. The artwork depicts messenger ducks flying across the night sky, carrying our good wishes. Indigenous students are represented in each of the reads in the foreground, and our pastoral care classes are represented in the collective statements, messages and signatures from 700 students and 100 staff. Acknowledging the significant local elder, Pastor Uncle Ozzie Cruz, who was present at Uluru and a signatory of the original Statement from the Heart. The canvas was gifted to the Jigami community near Eden, and they are proud to be connected in our local community. The Uluru Statement from the Heart tells us what constitutional reforms empower Indigenous people to take a rightful place in their own country. Their children will flourish and their culture will be a gift to the country. Lumen Christi Catholic College looks forward to sharing in the gift, and they support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And a big thank you to the students. I think you can see that the future is in good hands when we have students like this who are so passionate about reform in our country.
Thank you, Minister. Can I just clarify, you are seeking leave to table this document?
I am seeking leave to table the document. Thank you, Deputy
Magnificent.
Speaker.
Is leave granted? Thank you. And in accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituent statement has concluded. I call on the clerk for the next item of business.
Government business, order of the day number 1, condolence motion on the death of Abe Shinzo, resumption of debate.
Thank you. So the question is that the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Gellibrand.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I join Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, in offering my sincere condolences and the condolences of all Australians to the late Shinzo Abe's family and to the people of Japan. It's hard to fathom that a statesman of such stature, such conviction and such determination could be felled by one cowardly act of violence. 4 days after his death, I visited the Consulate General of Japan in Melbourne, where I signed Mr Abe's condolence book. The Consul General, Mr Junju Shimada, spoke movingly of the outpouring of grief from the people of Victoria and about the large number of people who had been visiting the consulate to pay their respects. That flood of emotion demonstrates the relationship between Australia and Japan is not simply one based on the practicalities of commerce or of mutual national security concerns. It's a true friendship. Japan is one of Australia's closest diplomatic, trade and security partners. Mr Abe's achievements in strengthening the relationship between Japan and Australia have been well documented in this parliament. The elevation of our bilateral relationship to a special strategic partnership, the ratification of the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement, the championing of the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In 2014, shortly after my arrival in this place, Mr Abe gave an address in this parliament. He spoke about the painful history of World War II and the thawing of hostilities between two countries, between our countries, that led to what he called the second coming of Japan's industry. He spoke about the economic and social reform within his country and about our shared ideals: peace, freedom, democracy, and respect for human rights and the rule of law. His speech was received with great affection by members of this chamber, as Mr Abe's engagements with Australia so often were. Mr Abe was a true leader and a statesman. He was wholly dedicated to his nation and was determined to use his influence to effect change. And so, as Prime Minister, he set to work, quote, like a drill bit, he said in this parliament in 2014, breaking through the vested interests and the norms that have deep roots. Mr Abe's suite of economic policies, Abenomics, was bold. It had to be. And Mr Abe worked tirelessly to enact the reforms that would revitalise Japan. Indeed, at times, he was personally involved in discussions between employers and unions on wage increases. Abenomics delivered success, record low unemployment, an economic boom and more women in the workplace than ever before. Japan will still face many challenges in the future: below target GDP growth, demographic pressures and productivity and innovation concerns. But Mr Abe's vision and commitment saw Japan through a sluggish domestic economic environment and a volatile global context. He did not flinch. He negotiated, compromised and fought to break through inertia and convention. Importantly, Mr Abe opened Japan to the world. As Foreign Minister, Penny Wong said, Mr Abe, quote, had a vision of Japan that exercised a degree of influence in the world commensurate with its economic weight and cultural significance. Mr Abe was a realist. He knew that Japan's national interest was in globalisation, and he pursued this. He opened Japan up to global capital, foreign goods and international visitors. And as Japan's view of the world changed, so did Australia's view of Japan. I saw this in my own family. My grandparents' generation might have had cause for ongoing resentment against Japan in the wake of their experiences of the horrors of the Second World War. Shinzo Abe recognised this in his address to the Parliament when he told the House that, quote, our fathers and grandfathers lived in a time that saw Kokoda and Sandakan. How many young Australians with bright futures to come lost their lives? For those who made it through the war, how much trauma did they feel years and years later from these painful memories? I can find absolutely no words to say. I can only stay humble against the evils and horrors of history. May I most humbly speak for Japan and on behalf of the Japanese people here in sending my sincere condolences towards the many souls who lost their lives. After these humble words, Mr Abe went on to quote Prime Minister Robert Menzies, who upon the recommencement of relations between Australia and Japan declared that, quote, "Hostility to Japan must go. It is better to hope than always to remember." Good words. Mr Menzies, of course, went on to welcome Shinzo Abe's grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, to Australia as the first Japanese Prime Minister to visit the country after the war. Thanks to the efforts of this generation, by the time that I was born, I recall my two grandfathers in particular always seeking to extend the hand of friendship to the Japanese people and to the nation that Japan had become. My grandparents regularly hosted Japanese exchange students in our small country Queensland family, and I fondly remember listening agog as a small child about what life was like in Japan's modern new megacities, while also delighting in taking our young Japanese guests out of their comfort zones and directly exposing them to rural and regional Australia's unique flora and fauna. As a child, I had no conception of how far things had come for young people in Australia and Japan to be able to share these natural, human, cross-cultural exchanges. This kind of change only happens because of the work of individuals across generations who seek to build bridges of understanding and affection. And today, aided by cheap flights, great food and a welcoming culture, Aussies throng to Japan, and our cultural relationship is on track to match our economic one. A relationship of affection set to last many more generations to come. Every Japanese emperor's reign is given a name. And on April 1, 2019, Emperor Naruhito's era in Japanese history was officially named the Reiwa era. Reiwa is taken from a verse in a collection of 8th century Japanese poetry that refers to plum blossoms in spring. As Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe explained the naming of the era to the press that spring day. He said, quote, "Just as the plum blossoms announce the arrival of spring after the harsh cold of winter and bloom splendidly in all their glory, all Japanese will be able to make their own blossoms come into full bloom together with their hopes for tomorrow." Shinzo Abe's career was dedicated to bringing Japan into full bloom. It is incomprehensible that his life was cut short, that he was not able to see the full flourishing of the spring that he envisaged for his nation. But the seeds that he planted, the reforms that he nurtured, will continue to grow. As Prime Minister Albanese said, quote, "This low act of cruelty cannot be allowed to overshadow a life that was lived with such high purpose." With the death of Shinzo Abe, Australia has lost a great friend. Japan has lost a great leader, and the world has lost a great statesman. May he rest in peace.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The member for Riverina.
I concur with the fine words of the member for Gellibrand about Shinzo Abe. Deputy Speaker, anybody here seen our old friend Shinzo? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, and it seems the good, they die young. You know, I just looked around and he's gone. Of course, they are the words of the song written by Dick Holler, performed, first recorded by Dion, and they refer to Martin, Abraham and John. And we know that the good, they do die young. Bobby Kennedy, 1968, who said, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." The same could perhaps be said, definitely be uttered, about Shinzo Abe. Bobby Kennedy's brother John, assassinated in 1963. Abraham Lincoln, we go back to 1865. And of course, Martin Luther King in 1968. All great leaders. All men who made a pivotal change, not just in their communities, their states, their countries, but had a global influence that the likes of which we may never see again. On the 8th of July, the world was stunned by the assassination of the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe during a campaigning speech in Nara 2 days before elections were to be held. And while domestic debates about improved security for members of Parliament continue in Japan, it's also very timely
to think about, to consider, to reflect upon Shinzo Abe's wonderful achievements, the legacy of them, not only just in terms of his foreign policy, but especially here in Australia, what he did, what he represented, and what will continue as his legacy for many years to come in this country. I come here as the member for Riverina and Central West. The town of Cowra this Friday will commemorate 78 years since the famous, some might say infamous, breakout at the internment camp. Cowra lost its innocence on the 5th of August 1944 and was thrust into a war zone, which until that very moment was confined to anywhere but Cowra. The prisoner of war camp custodians, member of Australian Militia's 22nd Garrison Battalion, are mostly older veterans and men who were deemed unfit for the front line, but they faced a dire situation. We had Japanese internees holed up in this camp who, 1,100 of them, prisoners of war, in 3 groups, stormed the boundaries of their confines and broke out. And in the ensuing calamity, 231 Japanese soldiers and 4 Australians were killed. You might think that Cowra would be hostile forevermore about Japan relations. No, not at all. And what they've done is they've gone out of their way to forge ties between Cowra and Japan, between Cowra and Tokyo. Those Japanese gardens, which are one of the finest gardens in the state, if not the country, are visited by many, many people. And for those who haven't been there, I suggest you put it on your list of things to do. But the relationship between Cowra and the international peace and understanding that has followed that has not been lost on both citizens here and in Honshu, Hokkaido, Shikoku and Kyushu. And I know that when the late Japanese leader addressed the Parliament, 8th of July in 2014, I know that was especially celebrated and commemorated and thought about in Cowra, because I know the close relationships they have with Japan. And that speech that Shinzo Abe gave was so emblematic and reflective of the relationship that Cowra has with Japan, with Australians generally have with Japan. And I go back to John Blackjack McEwen and how he forged trade ties with Japan at a time when being friends with Japan was not popular. Not popular at all because of what happened in World War II. But as Prime Minister Abe said himself, our fathers and grandfathers lived in a time that saw Kokoda and Sandakan. How many young Australians with bright futures to come lost their lives? For those who made it through the war, how much trauma did they feel years and years later from these painful memories? I can find absolutely no words to say. I can only stay humble against the evils and horrors of history. May I most humbly speak for Japan and on behalf of the Japanese people here in sending my most sincere condolences towards the many souls who lost their lives. And of course, he was wonderfully thought of here in Australia, as he should be. And his loss is mourned by people, peace-loving people, right across this nation. He was a great man. He stood for great things, just like the Kennedys, just like Martin Luther, just like Abraham Lincoln. Good men gone too young. Wonderful leaders, shot down, one could say, in their prime. And whilst I appreciate that Shinzo Abe had his terms at the top and had served his nation well, he still had much more to give, Deputy Speaker. He still had so much more to do. And he spoke of Australia and Japan's relationship of trust in that 2014 speech to our Parliament. He spoke of standing up through the trials of history in the cooperation in the area of security. Also trade. We've lost a great friend. We've lost a great partner. And certainly in my electorate, I know Cowra felt his loss, as did good, peace-loving people right across this nation, and I pass on my condolences to his family, to Japan, and certainly to those in Australia, all of us who mourn his passing. May he rest in peace.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The member for Wills.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I would also like to join my parliamentary colleagues in mourning the tragic death of Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister and, of course, a long-time friend of Australia. For over a decade, Shinzo Abe was really a giant of international relations, not just in our region, but I think it would be accurate to say across the globe. He can be really credited with evolving Japan's approach to foreign affairs and security policy, which was, of course, hardly an easy task. After decades in the post-World War II period of what we could probably characterise as a reluctance to have a more forthright or forward-leaning engagement in both the region and global affairs, Japan really re-emerged under Abe as a leader in regional and global affairs. And he made this goal clear. He was open about it. He spoke about how fundamental freedom, democracy, basic human rights and the rule of law were in developing his diplomatic relationships and bilateral relationships. So much has been said and will continue to be said about and written about Abe's legacy since his death. But I think, as we all do, want to particularly pay tribute to his immense contribution to the Indo-Pacific. And even that phrase itself is something that has evolved and come from all of his tremendous work. He was the one who popularised the conception of our region as the Indo-Pacific and highlighted how important the region is to international affairs. We are no longer suffering, in some respects, Australia, the tyranny of distance, as we had been earlier last century on the other side of the world. Now we are front and centre in probably the most important region in global affairs. And Abe recognised that very, very clearly and very early. He spoke in his tenure as Prime Minister about a confluence of the two seas between the Pacific and Indian Oceans and the strategic importance of framing our region in this way, seeing it in that way, understanding it in that way. And not only did he recognise, but he embraced India as an important partner in our region, something that we, I think, learnt from, frankly, given what I have described in the past as the somewhat benign neglect of India. A lot of talk about cricket, curry and the Commonwealth, which is great, but it's so much more than that, the relationship, and it can be so much more than that. And Abe, to his great credit, understood the importance of India as a rising power in the region. He welcomed a common objective of a free, open and secure Indo-Pacific. And he advanced that goal, leading through the creation of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which continues today, an increasingly important partnership between Australia, Japan, India and the United States, another great Pacific power. And he can be given credit for not only the Quad's creation, but its continued significance to our region in many respects to get the balance right in our region. He identified the need for a drastic reshaping, as he called it, in the areas of diplomacy and security. And he made a considered effort to build and develop bilateral and multilateral relationships that advanced the security of the Indo-Pacific, as he conceived it. And this included partnerships and work with ASEAN as part of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. He also helped save, to a certain extent, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, in which former US President Trump had abandoned. And Australia often looks, in many respects, to our major partners, our major friends and allies as part of our foreign affairs, for leadership, for support and coordination. I think it's probably true to say that we need to be looking at Abe's legacy, and Australia can really understand that he was such a good friend of ours, that the values that we share, that Australia and Japan share, democracy, human rights, the shared interests that we have in bolstering and propping up the international rules-based order, this is something that we can look to. We can look to that example with the work that Abe had done. He was actually the first Japanese leader to address this parliament in 2007, and it was his vision that helped elevate our bilateral relationship to a special strategic partnership in 2014. And under his leadership, Japan emerged as one of our like-minded partners in Asia, a legacy that endures today. I will say, just on a bit of a tangent, Deputy Speaker, I remember when I was in this place working as a National Security Advisor for former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, there was a moment where we were looking at enhancing our defence relationship with Japan, and that involved Japanese forces doing exercises in Australia on Australian territory. Now, I was very alive to the sensitivities to a lot of our veterans, including a lot of the RSL and all of the other stakeholders. And I remember calling up a lot of veterans and the RSL and talking them through the fact that we would be doing joint exercises with Japan in Queensland, for example. And I called Tom Uren, former Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of the party. Obviously, we know Tom was a POW in Burma, on the Burma railways, and suffered horrifically during World War II. And I said to Tom, look, I get how this might be difficult for you as a veteran. He was, I think, 90-something when I spoke to him. And I'll never forget, Deputy Speaker, what he said to me. He said, Peter, first of all, I appreciate you calling us to talk me through this, but I will never forget what I went through in World War II and what suffering myself, my comrades and I went through on the Burma Railway. It was horrific. Never forget. Never forgive to a certain extent, but never forget. But you've got to do what's in Australia's best national interests. And he was big enough a man and such a great figure himself that he was all about. He was overcoming his own emotional hurt to say, do what's important for Australia. And he understood that Japan was now a friend, even though he had that history during World War II. In conclusion, Deputy Speaker, I've got to say Abe's death is actually a tragedy. It's senseless in so many respects because of the brutal way he lost his life. And it's really so odd because of the relative lack of political violence in Japan. It's very uncharacteristic of modern Japan. And it's a tragedy also in the attack, I suppose, the randomness of the attack on the values, the ideals that he worked for decades to champion, those things that we've discussed in this motion. And so in a sense, it's an attack on all of us, and we need to stand firm on that. All of us who uphold, defend and promote the values that we cherish in our region and across the globe. So it's the loss of a husband as well, the loss to his family, the loss to his nation, and I extend my deepest condolences to his partner, that has been his partner for decades, and the loss of a life that had so much more to contribute to affairs of the region. A loss for all of us who admired Abe and his leadership. A loss for Australia, who's lost a true friend. Vale Shinzo Abe.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The member for Wannon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And I rise today with a very sad heart following the death of Shinzo Abe. I must say I was absolutely shocked when I heard the news that he had been shot, and absolutely shocked and saddened when I heard the news that that shot ended up being fatal. Can I say to the Japanese public, our hearts, our thoughts and our prayers are still with you following that awful, awful incident. And can I particularly say to the ambassador here in Australia from Japan, my good friend Shingo Yamagami, I offer my sincere condolences to you, because for you, not only has your country lost a great leader and warrior in the best sense of the word, but also a dear, dear friend. And I think it is a call to all of us
in every democracy that we have to always make sure that we're doing everything we can to safeguard democracy, and that means we've also got to be doing everything we can to make sure we are safeguarding those who stand up and are prepared to put themselves forward to be representatives in our countries. Because if the price is going to be the price that Shinzo Abe paid for those who do put themselves forward, then that is too great a cost for anyone to bear, any country to bear, any family to bear. And so we have to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect those who put themselves forward. Shinzo Abe has left a remarkable legacy, not only for Japan, but for the world. And it is a legacy that I'm sure the Japanese people will seek to protect and seek to honour. But it is one that Australia and all Australians must seek to protect and honour as well, because he had a vision for the type of region that we want to live in well ahead of its time. And he started to put important architecture in place to ensure that the Indo-Pacific would be a region, as he said, that was free and open, or as I like to say as well, peaceful and prosperous. And that architecture that he was putting in place, we have to ensure that it continues to grow so that that vision that he had for a free and open Indo-Pacific will continue. A lot's been spoken of the importance of the Quad in that architecture, and it is critically important architecture. And all of us, all members of the Quad, and particularly Australia, has to ensure that the Quad continues to grow and can continue to deliver on its raison d'etre, which is a free and open Indo-Pacific. Former Prime Minister Abe knew the importance of the Quad, and he knew the importance in particular of Japan and India developing and growing and enhancing their relationship. And Australia can play its role in making sure that that crucial relationship continues to develop and continues to grow, and we must do so. On the strategic front, in 2014, former Prime Minister Abe said this in our federal parliament: "In everything we say and do, we must follow the law and never fall back into force or coercion." That was 2014. And sadly, since then, we have seen one particular country try and use force and coercion to dictate and determine what type of Indo-Pacific we should live in. Now, Australia, with the strong support of Japan, has fought back against that coercion, strongly fought back against that coercion, and showed the rest of the world that you didn't have to be intimidated or cower when you had coercion used against you. And now that we've done that, and now we've clearly demonstrated that coercion does not work and will not work, we've got to make sure that we continue to put the rules in place, that we send a clear message that coercion into the future will not work. And to do that, it's incredibly important that we also recognise what Shinzo Abe had to say, not only on the security side, but also on the trade side, because that is equally important as the Quad is in making sure we've got the architecture right in the Indo-Pacific for that free and open, peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific that we're all looking for. Now, it was incredibly, I think, touching, incredibly moving for Shinzo Abe that he was able to sign the Australia-Japan FTA with our then Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. Incredibly important and moving because his grandfather had signed the initial commerce agreement between Australia and Japan, which really was the first clear demonstration that both countries had remarkably, in a very short period of time, forgiven and worked out and understood the importance of moving on. And that was done under the leadership of the then Prime Minister of Australia, Robert Menzies, who, and Shinzo Abe also quoted Menzies in that speech, who said, "It is better to hope than always to remember." Incredibly important words at that time, and it really sowed the seeds of the development of a relationship which I think now is incredibly unique between countries in the Indo-Pacific, Australia and Japan. And all that was then led to the Commerce Agreement, which led to the Japan-Australia FTA, which has been incredibly significant, especially for developing investment between Australia and Japan, and incredibly important investment by Japanese companies into Australia. And I say this very much in a non-partisan way, making sure that no state or territory or no Commonwealth government makes investment decisions without having the decency to consult, especially Japanese companies who invest heavily here and provide jobs here, is critically important to the ongoing nature of that investment relationship. But we have to make sure that everything that has come as a result of that commerce agreement, as a result of the FTA, continues, especially when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And Deputy Speaker, this is where I come now to another piece of important architecture that Shinzo Abe identified in 2014, and that was the then TPP. He knew that that was critically important to the ongoing peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, sadly, the United States decided not to proceed with being at the heart of the then what was called TPP. And Japan and Australia, following on from the Commerce Agreement, from our FTA, then got together and led the way in ensuring that CPTPP could come into force. And it now is an incredibly important part of the architecture of the Indo-Pacific. But Shinzo Abe's vision for what that economic architecture might look like would be under threat if we make the wrong decisions about CPTPP membership. We have to ensure that anyone who wants to join CPTPP understands the importance of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and importantly, understands the rule of law and would never fall back into force or coercion to try and dictate their way in the Indo-Pacific. Now, we know what it's like to be on the receiving end of economic coercion, and it has hurt our industries for no good reason. But those industries have stood by the government to make sure that we didn't succumb to that coercion, because they understood how important sovereignty is to our nation. And we have to make sure, as we progress the CPTPP going forward, that we continue to listen to our key partners, and in particular to Japan, as to what form and shape that CPTPP should take and who should be allowed to be a member and who shouldn't. And we both strongly agree that anyone who wants to use economic coercion should not be a member of CPTPP. And that should remain to be our position as a nation going forward. Because if not, The legacy that was put in place by Shinzo Abe will start to be eroded, and that is in none of our interests. Shinzo Abe lost his life far too early. He lost his life in the most tragic circumstances far too early. But like any great leader, he has left a remarkable legacy. And as we come together to remember a great life lived, we also must all commit to ensuring that that legacy is not lost and that we continue to fight for it. Because if we do, we will live in the best region in the world, not the most dangerous region in the world. Thank you.
And I call the member for Brand.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise to join the Prime Minister and other honourable members in expressing my personal sadness and my deepest sympathies to the people of Japan at the passing in such tragic circumstances of Abe Shinzo, the former Prime Minister of Japan. The assassination of Mr Abe was an absolutely shocking event in a country that is very peaceful. I've had the great good fortune to visit Japan for work and on holidays many times, an extraordinarily peaceful and friendly country, and to see such violence put upon a former leader was just a horrific thing to have witnessed. Mr Abe was a catalyst for change in Japan and across the whole region. He was a true friend of Australia. He was admired the world over for his leadership and diplomacy. Mr Abe has been a crucial player in the extraordinarily close bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan. Mr Abe visited Australia 5 times as Prime Minister. He was at the centre of delivering a number of historic agreements that brought our economies closer together, creating decades of resources, trade and investment for the advancement and energy security of both nations. The friendship he offered Australia was immensely consequential and helped shape and continues to shape our region as we understand it today. In no small way, he also helped shape Australia's modern economic outlook. Mr Abe, when he was Prime Minister of Japan, and the Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott concluded negotiations for the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement in 2014. It was signed in the same year and came into force the year after in this country. The existing economic partnership between our two countries was cemented by this free trade agreement and has ensured Japan and Australia's ongoing trading and economic relationship. Mr Abe also saw our bilateral relationship elevated to a special strategic partnership in 2014. Mr Abe has made 4 major visits to Australia that have impacted our relationship and the relationship between Japan and our resources and energy sector. I was honoured to attend when he came to Darwin in 2018 for the official opening of the INPEX LNG facility, which is one of the world's most significant gas projects. It was driven by over $35 billion worth of investment from Japan. The Ichthys LNG project remains the largest ever Japanese overseas investment, and Japan chose Australia. Japan chose Darwin. Mr Abe was very much aware of the significance of the Ichthys project for the energy security of his own country, as are we. On this same visit, very significantly, Mr Abe attended a ceremony commemorating the 76th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin. And in that ceremony, he and our Prime Minister of the day, Scott Morrison, commemorated the hundreds of people killed in the bombings of Darwin so many years ago. And Mr Abe renewed his vow towards peace at that time. Reflecting on the significance of this moment, Mr Abe said, and I quote, "Thanks to the devoted efforts of many, Japan and Australia have achieved reconciliation and have become special strategic partners, driving regional peace and prosperity." I was very privileged to have attended that ceremony in Darwin, and as many that were there will have observed before, it was indeed very moving and an extraordinary display of how much the relationship between our two countries have changed over so many years. On that same trip, he attended the Australia-Japan Summit meeting. During this visit, a Memorandum of Understanding was signed between CSIRO and the Japan Oil, Gas and Metals National Corporation to increase cooperation and encourage joint research activities in support of the hydrogen value chain and unconventional resources for energy. This Memorandum of Understanding is paying off now as we see continued investment from Japan into hydrogen activities and the development of that industry in Australia. Again, like LNG, for our energy security, but also, of course, for the energy security of Japan itself. Very significantly, Mr Abe became the first Japanese Prime Minister to address both Houses of Parliament in Canberra. This added a new dimension to the Australian and Japan relationship, which is now a very deep friendship founded on mutual respect, trust and openness. Japan and Australia were the first countries to place the Indo-Pacific over and above their existing foreign policies at the time. And like the member for Wannon, I want to acknowledge the work Mr Abe and the diplomatic heft of Japan did in relation to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Under his leadership, the CPTPP was progressed after the US sadly deserted this important multilateral trade agreement spanning the Indo-Pacific. Australia joined Japan in the challenge of reviving the CPTPP under the leadership in Australia of former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. The CPTPP in its new form, after America had left, ultimately came into force in this country in 2018. I want to acknowledge the economic magnitude of Mr Abe's role in ensuring Japan played a lead role, and it not only played a lead role, they took it back up when the TPP was on the floor and nearly abandoned. And the significance of the CPTPP cannot be underestimated. It accounts for 11 countries, representing 495 million people. Nations with a combined GDP of over $13.5 trillion. It is an agreement of vast significance, and I'm proud that in opposition Labor supported this through the Parliament, as it will be a key driver of economic growth in our region, a vital piece of trade and investment architecture for our region, which will ensure peace and prosperity for many years to come. The impact of the extraordinary partnership between Australia and Japan is plain for all to see. Last year, Japan was Australia's second largest resource export trading partner, with $52 billion in export earnings. Our LNG exports earned Australia $17.2 billion. There was $12.8 billion derived from exporting coal to Japan, $11.3 billion in iron ore exports and $1.3 billion in aluminium exports. Mr Abe's was a life of consequence. He made a difference. He changed things for the better, and not just for Japan, but for our region and around the world. He was a giant on the world stage, and his legacy was one of global impact and global leadership, and a positive one in strengthening the relationship between Japan and Australia. Again, I express my sincere condolences to the people of Japan for the loss of such an exceptional leader that was Mr Shinzo Abe. The world is all the worse for his passing, but is made much better by his life. I commend the motion to the House.
And I give the call to the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on this condolence motion at the shocking death by assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. I'll start by noting one of his excellent legacies is that we appropriately refer to him as Abe Shinzo, rather than the previous Western custom of Shinzo Abe. It was under his prime ministership that Japanese custom changed when it came to referring to their names in the Latin alphabet. It had been the case going back more than a century, I think to the 1870s, that in the Latin alphabet and when interacting with Westerners, whether that be through diplomatic or commercial ties, that the Japanese felt it would be easier for us to understand the concoction of their names by expressing them the way we do. But of course it is the case in many Eastern Asian cultures, and certainly the case in Japan, that the family name, surname, is expressed first. And it was his government that made that change. It might not seem significant to us, but it's a very important one within Japanese culture. And so I commend the wording of the motion to appropriately express his name as Abe Shinzo, which is the correct Japanese expression of their name. I grew up in a family very significantly influenced by the Second World War, and particularly our conflict with Japan. My father's father served firstly in North Africa and then in the Pacific as an officer in the Royal Engineers. My mother's mother was a nurse in the Australian Army, and she served at the Heidelberg Hospital, caring for many returning prisoners of war, Australian prisoners of war who had been subjected to enormous horrors through Southeast Asia, particularly at the hands of Japanese forces during the Second World War. And actually also my father's uncle, my grandmother's brother, served in Papua New Guinea and received the Military Cross at Gona in the battle soon after the Kokoda Trail campaign in late 1942. And it is fair to say that the attitudes of that generation towards the Japanese people was a very difficult one. And I did grow up in an environment, particularly as I started to engage myself with Japanese culture and Japanese people, with the shadow of those attitudes. And I think many Australians had those shared experiences with that generation. But equally, that generation, some particularly Weary Dunlop, was very significant in leading a process of making Australians understand the need for us to forgive. It's very important to forgive, even where great evil has occurred. And our relationship with Japan now in 2022 is unbelievable, and would be unbelievable to some of those that served in the Second World War, where, of course, we were engaged against the Imperial Japanese forces. And the life of Abe Shinzo has transcended the great maturity and depth of the relationship we now have today with the nation of Japan and the Japanese people. Previous speakers have talked about Abe Shinzo's grandfather, of course, the very significant role he played with Sir Robert Menzies in first establishing economic ties through the Commerce Agreement between Japan and Australia. And that agreement and the economic trade relationship that we've had with Japan since then has underpinned an enormous part of Australia's modern prosperity, and we have come to understand, going way back to the 1950s, how critical the Japanese market has been to us. But in more recent times, we've also come to understand the significance of the security relationship, and Abe Shinzo was absolutely central to the modern security relationship that we have with Japan, to the status and the place that Japan has within the Indo-Pacific region, and many alliances, not just the relationship with Australia, but many other fellow-minded nations in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, the quadrilateral dialogue is one of the greatest parts of his legacy, where our country, Japan, the United States and India have a process to cooperate on these security issues to ensure that we are keeping our region safe and we are living in a free, open Indo-Pacific. And I don't think we would have that process if it was not for Abe Shinzo and his leadership. He was also a very significant economic leader within Japan, and his approach to economics, Abenomics as it is colloquially referred to, that has made an enormous impact in shaking off those, what the Japanese people refer to as the lost decades there. And before my career in politics, I spent almost a decade in the wool industry. I travelled to Japan very regularly in that capacity. I was involved with a joint venture with a Japanese company in Malaysia. They were an enormous market or still are an enormous market for Australian merino wool and textiles, and they were excellent partners in commerce. And that was in the era of Abe Shinzo prior and in the early years of his time as Prime Minister, and his impact on trade was very significant. And we've talked about TPP and the other, the direct free trade agreement. Free trade is a very fraught topic in any nation. And even in this country, where we have a lot of pride in our embracing of free trade, it's always much more straightforward in principle, and then when it gets down to specifics and particular industries, etc., that can be a challenge. And in Japan, of course, they have been, even to this day, very deeply scarred from the blockade that was put in place prior to the two nuclear detonations and the peace in 1945, where the Japanese people were, in all respects, starved of key resources. And it's been, again, in the culture of Japan in the decades since to be self-sufficient in so many of those products that were denied to them during that blockade. And Japanese farmers are no different to Australian farmers or farmers anywhere on the planet, and they tend to have a lot of political influence and like a fair bit of protection from their government. So the things that Abe Shinzo did in trade that have presented opportunities for our country were indeed courageous within his domestic politics. And as a South Australian, Japan is a very significant market for us, not just in resources as it is for this country, but obviously the seafood industry, many other products from South Australia find a happy export home in Japan, and we're very lucky to have that market and that deep relationship. Just conclude on making the point about the tragic circumstances of Abe Shinzo's death by assassination. It is something that all of us who are representatives in a democratic process, it shakes us to the core, I think, because the previous speakers have talked about the fact that political assassination, of course, is something we hope never to see occurring. But in Japan in particular, much like in this country, it is something extremely out of the ordinary. And coming on the back of other similar incidents in the United Kingdom in recent years, it is a very concerning and surprising development that Abe Shinzo, as a former Prime Minister in Japan, out campaigning for his democratic beliefs in an election, was approached in the street and shot fatally. And it's something we need to remember as democratic representatives, that we've got to take that risk seriously, but also ensure that we don't let it infringe on our democracy. And to me, I was with my good friend Senator Simon Birmingham at the time we heard of the news of Abe Shinzo's. At that stage, the fact that he'd been shot, not that he had succumbed to the wounds of that attack, but we were reflecting on, in Senator Birmingham's case, he had met Prime Minister Abe and been very engaged with his government on trade matters. And it is particularly shocking for that someone that you've met has now been assassinated in this profession that we have. And there will be many members in this House that served in the Parliament when he addressed the joint sitting, that very famous address of a joint sitting of Parliament that would have met Prime Minister Abe. And it is truly shocking that someone that has the same vocation as us has been shot dead in the street because he's engaged in the same profession that we are. And that is something that unfortunately we have no choice but to come to terms with, but equally it's something to be utterly condemned as part of our process of reflecting on his life and his contribution. So with that, I thank the Prime Minister and others who have provided the opportunity for us to pay tribute to such a great man, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Japan, someone that provided unbelievable leadership to his country, but importantly for us equally as Australians, has transformed our relationship with Japan, our place in the Indo-Pacific, Japan's place in the Indo-Pacific, for the better.
And I give the call to the member for Fisher.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to extend my condolences to the family of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, to his party, his parliament and to the people of Japan. And I congratulate the member for Sturt on such a fine condolence speech. Mr Deputy Speaker, former Prime Minister Abe was a great friend to the people of Australia and a true statesman of Japan and of democracy in our region. Over nearly 9 years as Prime Minister and nearly 3 decades as a Member of Parliament, Abe Shinzo was single-minded in his pursuit of a stronger Japan, a more connected Indo-Pacific and a more peaceful world. Under his leadership, the friendship between Japan and Australia flourished, coinciding with the birth of the Quad Alliance and the governments of John Howard, Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. In fact, in 2014, he became the first Japanese Prime Minister to address the Australian Parliament, using the occasion to highlight our shared values as two parliamentary democracies and constitutional monarchies, which extends beyond the fences between political parties. And that speech that he gave to the Australian Parliament really demonstrated such the long way that our relationships have developed since the Second World War. And it reminded me of my grandfather, who served in the Royal Australian Navy. He had very strong views, as many people did of his generation, towards the Japanese. I remember as a young child, we'd sold the family Ford Fairlane and bought a Honda Accord, and I don't think my grandfather talked to my dad for a week afterwards because he was so angry that we'd swapped from an Australian car to a Japanese car. And that was the culture of our, and I'm sure being of a similar vintage, our grandparents who had endured those war years that they had. But fast forward many decades and our relationship between Australia and Japan is now, of course, on extremely solid footing. Mr Deputy Speaker, during his leadership, former Prime Minister Abe steered the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement launched by John Howard and concluded by Malcolm Turnbull. 65 years after former Prime Minister Abe's grandfather concluded the Japan-Australia Agreement on Commerce with Robert Menzies, Japan remains Australia's third largest trading partner, second largest export market and second largest source of foreign direct investment. This economic relationship, as well as our strong academic, sporting and cultural exchange, is testament to a deep and mature partnership which stands Australians and their businesses in good stead. Prime Minister Abe was also instrumental in realising the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the wake of growing populism on the left and the right and in the face of protectionism. His approach to economic leadership in Japan and in the global economy was so remarkable that Abenomics has joined Thatcherism and Reaganomics as a well-known political eponym. His three so-called arrows of monetary easing in fiscal stimulus and structural reforms, reflation, spending and growth have widely been lauded as a stroke of economic genius in the face of global and domestic financial pressures. Prime Minister Abe believed, and I quote, "A robust economy is a source of national strength for Japan." And a stronger Japan is very good news for democracies in the Indo-Pacific. Former Prime Minister Abe joined the coalition in developing more comprehensive strategic security partnership in complement to the work of the Quad Alliance, cooperating on shared challenges such as cybersecurity and emerging tech, terrorism and the threat of extremism, COVID-19 and regional health security and conflict in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. He began to change the way Japan and its self-defence forces engaged in collective security overseas, and in so doing made clear that Japan would back her allies. And he didn't shy away from the mounting global pressures which threatened his pursuit of a free and open Indo-Pacific. He contended with an increasingly more belligerent China intent on impinging Japanese territorial sovereignty. Former Prime Minister Abe called out the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's aggression, their debt-trap diplomacy and their record on human rights when many others would not. He defended the rights of Tibetans and Hong Kongers to self-determination. He grappled with a malicious dictator in North Korea. He resumed relations with Russia after centuries of conflict in the pursuit of a lasting peace. And he acknowledged the role of Japan as an economic power to assert its moral power as well in responding to regional health concerns like Ebola and COVID-19. Prime Minister Abe demonstrated that he was prepared to take up the fight to those who would threaten peace and stability in the region and Japan's territorial sovereignty. He also showed that through strong economic leadership and a single-minded devotion to do what is right, a leader can transform a nation in the wake of all kinds of trials. Conviction like this, Mr Deputy Speaker, is rare in politics in the modern era. But that conviction cost him his job in 2007 in a period of what Japan endured as a revolving door of politics. And it means that he saw off his fair share of political, economic and indeed health challenges. Mr Deputy Speaker, there's a famous Japanese proverb, Nana korobi ya okai, which means fall down 7 times, get up 8. Prime Minister Abe put it this way: our predecessors overcame many troubles and much suffering, but each time got back up stronger than before. Prime Minister Abe's story of conviction over convenience, of integrity over expedience, and of resilience in the wake of grave and near insurmountable challenges. He was a thoroughly modern Conservative leader who broke through the vested interests and norms that had such deep roots in his party and his country. In his own words, Prime Minister Abe was a patriot. He didn't back down when totalitarian dictators and ideologues challenged him one way or the other. He was a true conviction politician and a true friend and ally of the Australian people. May he rest in peace.
And I thank the member for Fisher for his contribution. I understand it is the wish of honourable members to signify at this stage their respect and sympathy by rising in their places, and I ask all present to do so. And I thank the Federation Chamber. I give the call to the member for Gilmore.
I move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
No, can we do that again, please? I'll give you the call first, and then if you could ask for leave.
Okay.
Thank you. The member for Gilmore has the call.
I move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
No, you need to seek leave.
I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
Leave is granted.
I move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
Is there a seconder?
Yes, Deputy Speaker, I second the motion.
The question is that further proceedings be conducted in the House. All of those of opinion? All of those of that opinion? No? The ayes have it. The Clerk.
Further statements in relation to the death of Archibald William Archie Roach AM.
Are there any statements? And I give the call to the member for Perth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Archie Roach was a musician and storyteller with the most generous of thought. He managed to have all of us know and think about First Peoples' lives and the hardship which they have endured. He put stories of and histories of generations of unfairness, generations of tragedy before each of us so gently that change was possible, so gently that we could all believe that further change is possible. Archie Roach opened up possibilities of reconciliation and possibilities of a fairer Australia. He showed us that songs share stories and that songs and stories can change nations. He let us know what could and should be done, but never in a harsh way, but in a way that opened up the hearts of all of us. He was born in 1956 in Victoria. Just a few years into his life, he was forcibly removed from his family and taken to life on a mission. Placed into foster care, he was told he was an orphan. Eventually, he found a home with Alex and Dulcie Cox, a family of great enthusiasm for music. His foster father, I should say, would sing traditional Scottish music. His eldest sister from that family, Mary, taught the basics of guitar and keyboard. Archie said of his foster father, quote, "He was a big influence on me, a good influence. I'll love him to the day I die." And I think we all recognise that that influence gave us that amazing sharing of story through song, which gave us the Archie Roach that we are celebrating the life of today. He received a letter when he was about 14 years old telling of the fact that his mother, his biological mother, had passed. This is when the reality of what happened in Archie Roach's early life struck him. He was enraged. He left his foster home with nothing but a guitar, no money, no possessions, just a guitar and, understandably, some anger on his search for his parents and the story of his life. In that search, as a teenager, he met Ruby Hunter. They would later marry, form a band and start a life in Melbourne. That life gave us the song that has been so celebrated in this place, "Took the Children Away," which tells us so painfully, but also with much hope, the story of the stolen generation and his experience of having been removed from his family. One of the first times he performed that, and one of the largest early audiences he performed that song to, was during the protests of the bicentenary celebrations in 1988. That performance, to a mainly white audience, was at first met with complete silence. The story, which I think kind of shows that silence is not always a sign of disapproval, but a sign of emotion and people learning afresh. Paul Kelly shares the story that, quote, he finished the song and there was still dead silence. Archie thought he'd bombed, that everybody hated it. So he just turned it and started to walk off stage. And as he walked off, applause started to build and build and build. People were so stunned at the end of the song that it took them a little while just to gather themselves and applaud. That is one of the nation's great storytellers, Paul Kelly, telling us about one of our nation's other great storytellers, Archie Roach. He released Charcoal Lane in 1990, which featured that song. He was nominated for ARIA Breakthrough Artist in 1991. He won a Human Rights Achievement Award. He released 9 albums, including collaborations with none other than Bob Dylan, Billy Bragg, Tracy Chapman, Patti Smith, and so many more. I couldn't name them all. He was honoured in 2015 on the Queen's Birthday Honours as a member of the Order of Australia for his services to music and equally, not just his service to music, but for his role as a campaigner for social justice. And in 2020, he was named Victoria Australian of the Year. While he was owned and his life was in Victoria, he was loved by Western Australians. He came through Western Australia so many times over the years. He came to open the Perth Festival. He's performed in Broome, the Nannup Music Festival. He's performed with Paul Kelly at Optus Stadium, just to name a few. Always doing more than performing songs, always sharing stories, always sharing insights, always leaving people with a greater and deeper understanding of the true history of this country, Australia. He was set to perform at the Perth Concert Hall earlier this year in May, and sadly postponed for health reasons. However, I am so fortunate that I got to see Archie, his band and many others perform in 2017 when my dad, Ron Gorman, organised a family outing to the Astor Theatre in my electorate in Mount Lawley. Dad was insistent that we would all go as a family to this concert. It was to mark the 20th anniversary of the Bringing Them Home report. That inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. We had Salen Garlett provide a welcome to country. We had footage screened to us of Lang Hancock's statement about, quote, fixing the Aboriginal problem, an appalling statement then, as it is now. We had a screening of the apology from Prime Minister Rudd. And we had many stories shared between the audience and Archie. And I'm just going to use a few words from my father, Ron Gorman, who is the person I know who has seen Archie Roach perform more than anyone else. He's both in Victoria and in the West. Ron Gorman says, quote, being in his presence, you knew that the time with him was special, not just, quote, a great gig, but a moment of enlightenment. His legacy lives with all of us as we reach out for his desire to have complex issues known and to have voice. As an artist and creator, I always thought of Archie as a national treasure. That treasure is now in our hearts and minds. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
And I give the call to the member for Barara.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to pay tribute to one of Australia's most treasured performers, Indigenous musician and songwriter Archie Roach. I just want to acknowledge the lovely tribute from a member opposite who had seen Archie Roach many times. Colleagues on both sides have spoken about Archie's life and career, a survivor of the stolen generation who battled with both alcoholism and homelessness. Archie's was no easy life. Yet when he met the love of his life, Ruby Hunter, another child of the stolen generation, he said she changed his life forever. With Ruby by his side, Archie went on to write music that in turn changed the lives of Australians. Archie contributed his love of music to his foster family. He attributed his love of music to his foster family, the Coxes, and he used to flick through his foster father Alex Cox's vinyl records. But it was his need for healing that inspired his deepest passion for music. It helped him heal from the trauma of his youth. If Roach's melodies came from a place of suffering, his lyrics gave voice to the thousands of Indigenous Australians who'd been removed from their families as part of the stolen generation. I was privileged to witness one of Archie's last performances at the Reconciliation Australia Governance Awards in June. It's actually the very first event I attended as the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. And I want to thank Reconciliation Australia's CEO, Karen Mundine, for holding that memorable event, and Andrew Meehan, both for his work in pulling the event together and his assistance in reminding me of some of the songs that Archie played that night. When Archie stepped forward to perform, it was clear he wasn't well. He took a while to start. He was dependent on the oxygen, which had been a feature of his life in recent years. But when he did start, the room had anticipated the music. They'd anticipated his voice with his deep soulfulness and the raspy voice, and the simplicity of his profound lyrics was mesmerising. With a captive audience, Archie performed 3 songs from his repertoire. One song, Small Child, and The Old Mission Road. The Old Mission Road touched me deeply. It touched me here. It's a blues song about losing your parents. Seeing him as sick as he was, singing the song evocative of the pain and loss of a member of the stolen generation really got to me. And the words would move anyone who had experience of the loss of a parent. If I can take the indulgence of the House, I'd like to take a moment to read the lyrics for the benefit of the House. Oh, I wish I had grown with my mother back home, because I miss her sweet kisses and her smile. And when I'm alone, I wish I had known my mother for just a while. Won't you walk with me, darling, just a couple of miles? Won't you tell me the stories of when I was a child? I'd be so happy as the stories unfold. Won't you walk with me, darling, down that old mission road? Oh, I wish I'd gone fishing with my father I'm still missing, and the touch of his strong, gentle hands. Now I'm gone from the mission because someone's decision kept me away from that man. Won't you walk with me, darling, just for a couple of miles? Won't you tell me the stories of when I was a child? I'd be so happy as the stories unfold. Won't you walk with me, darling, down that old mission road? So kiss your mother good night, hold your father tight, and keep your family near, or else one day they might slowly fade out of sight, just reflections in those tears. Won't you walk with me, darling, just a couple of miles? Won't you tell me the stories of when I was a child? I'd be so happy as the stories unfold. Won't you walk with me, darling, down that old mission road? I extend my deepest condolences to the Roach family, to Archie's 2 sons, Amos and Eben, to Archie's 3 foster kids, Chris, Arthur and Terence. May his memory be a blessing. Australians will continue to be inspired by Archie Roach's musical legacy for generations to come.
And I give the call to the Deputy Speaker, the member for Newcastle.
And thank you, Deputy Speaker. When I heard news of Uncle Archie Roach's passing just on the weekend, my heart broke a little. And I expect that that was a feeling shared by many, many thousands of Australians. And that's why I'm really honoured to be able to rise in this Australian Parliament today to both remember but honour the extraordinary life and legacy of that great songman, Archie Roach. As I said, he passed away last week, aged just 66. It's a young age in Australia these days. But it was after a long illness. I want to acknowledge the lovely tributes from the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, my colleague, the member for Perth, with the great tellings of his family's experiences of going to those concerts early days in Perth. Of course, Uncle Archie Roach's career spanned almost 4 decades, so there's a lot to tell if you wanted to track through each of those different stages of his life. He fell in love with gospel and country music as a young man. He survived, as we've heard, periods of great trauma, of homelessness and dependency on alcohol, but that trauma of being separated from his family really kind of was such a strong theme and an important part of his project of healing in this nation throughout his life. He went on to, he recorded his debut album, was an ARIA Award-winning album, of course, Charcoal Lane, back in 1990. And that track, that anthemic track on that album is the one we all refer to today, and that is the song about Took the Children Away. That really defined and helped shape Archie's career, but really introduced him to a very large audience in Australia. He went on to actually record 9 albums and studio albums. He also did a film soundtrack and lots of compilations and live albums as well. His album in November of 2019, Tell Me Why, was his very first to reach the national top 10, and that was a pretty amazing achievement. Those very powerful songs of Archie Roach tell his story of really heartbreaking loss, but also of love and healing. And that was a journey he took through song and music, and so generously gave to all of us in this nation. He shared his life with his long life partner and his creative soulmate, Ruby Hunter. And as the Goanna frontman Shane Howard said, who is a long-time friend of Archie and Ruby, he said earlier this week, "It is very raw, it is very real. It's a lot to lose, but I think Ruby might be calling him home." Uncle Archie was a very proud Gunditjmara and Bundjalung senior elder. He was a musician, an author, a poet, a philosopher, a human rights campaigner. And as we've heard from many of the speeches, he was a member of the Stolen Generations. And whilst born in Mupuna in Victoria, Archie was just 3 years old when he was forcibly removed from his family. And he was placed in foster care, and like the experiences of so many from the stolen generation, he was told he was an orphan. He didn't know he still had family to track down. The member for Perth told very eloquently that story and that heartbreak, really. But there was an editorial in The Age on Archie's passing, which recalled the time at the very beginning of his music career, when in 1989, and he was still pretty much unknown to a mainstream Australian audience. He was invited to perform live at the Melbourne Concert Hall by Paul Kelly and the Messengers. And this was the concert the member for Perth just referred to, where he ended that relatively short set he was given as a support act on the evening with some pretty heart-wrenching recollections of his experiences of the stolen generations, and led with that song, "Took the Children Away." And of course, and I quote here, the welfare and the policeman said, "You've got to understand. We'll give them what you can't give. Teach them how to really live. Teach them how to live," they said. Humiliated them instead. Taught them that, taught them this, and others taught them prejudice. You took the children away. And as Paul Kelly, that other great Australian storyteller, would later recall, the audience sat there stunned. Paul Kelly says he finished the song and there was still dead silence. Archie Roach thought he'd totally bombed and everybody hated it, so he just turned and started exiting off stage. And as he walked off, there was this applause started to build and gathered such momentum. It just built and built, and it was an incredible reaction, Paul Kelly reflected. He said he'd never seen it before, where people were so stunned at the end of a song that it took them a while to gather themselves to be able to applaud. Of course, Archie Roach toured the world with headlining and opening shows for some of the greats. We had some of the great storytellers and songwriters: Joan Armatrading, Bob Dylan, Billy Bragg, Tracy Chapman, Susan Vega, and my much-loved Patti Smith. And that would have been my dream come true, to see Patti Smith and Uncle Archie Roach perform together. I've seen them both separately, but that is something I missed and I deeply regret. But certainly the tradition, the legacy that Archie Roach has left us is immense. I remember some of my very early education in challenging the stories that I might have been told about my nation when I was growing up as a young child, schooling in both Newcastle and Bermagui. It was songs from musicians and bands like No Fixed Address, Warumpi Band, many of those my introduction to early Indigenous contemporary music, that really made me think about the stories of nationhood. And it was those songs, and then songs of people like Uncle Archie Roach that came later, that really alerted me to an unsettled business in this nation. They were stories about land rights and sovereignty, of kinship, of trauma, and ultimately of healing. They were great, great gifts to our nation. Archie Roach's strength and courage in sharing his own story was crucial to establishing really great initiatives like having a Stolen Generations Redress Scheme. He never gave up on seeking justice. His generous gift to this nation of song and music is one that so many Australians have now taken to heart. Archie Roach changed lives, and he's helped change our nation, and for that we shall always be forever indebted. He showed us the power of music, not just as a healing agent, but also as a tool to seek justice. And at this time, I'm really thinking of his two sons, Amos and Eben, sending my heartfelt condolences to him and all the family during this sorry time. Please take some comfort in knowing that there are thousands of Australians mourning with you today.
And I give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business, the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise to join parliamentary colleagues from all sides of the House to pay tribute to the extraordinary life of the late Archie Roach. Mr Deputy Speaker, the arts offers a way to tell stories, to share and process experiences, to reflect pain and to send a message of hope. And Archie Roach used his music to do all this and more. Aboriginal people, of course, have an extraordinary artistic and cultural tradition. A culture which goes back over 60,000 years, has a central place for dance, for music, for painting, for storytelling, and many other artistic forms. And of course, there are many outstanding contemporary Aboriginal musicians, and Archie Roach stands out amidst that remarkable company. It's really no surprise, Mr Deputy Speaker, that while all Australians feel immense pride in this extraordinary country in which we live, the inheritors of that 65,000 years of culture have a particular gift for stunning and insightful portraits of our nation and the lives we live within it. And so as Shadow Arts Minister, I want to acknowledge and pay tribute to the remarkable contribution and life of Archie Roach. As we've heard, he was a multi-award-winning Aboriginal Australian musician, a campaigner for the rights of Indigenous Australians, just 3 years old when removed from his family. After several foster homes, he settled with Alex and Dulcie Cox, where he was surrounded by music which ignited his passion. He became a clear and strong voice of the stolen generation. Both he and his wife Ruby Hunter were survivors, and the songs they wrote together became a soundtrack for Indigenous Australians. He first became known for the song Took the Children Away, which featured on his debut solo album Charcoal Lane in 1990. This single won an International Human Rights Achievement Award, the first time one was ever awarded for a song, and the album was certified gold and won 2 ARIA awards. Charcoal Lane featured in the top 50 albums for 1992 by Rolling Stone magazine. He and Ruby Hunter also co-founded the Black Arm Band, a collective of Aboriginal artists. He recorded 10 studio albums, 2 live albums, 1 soundtrack album and 4 compilation albums, including the soundtrack for The Tracker, and has won 5 ARIA awards. In his later years in particular, Archie Roach collected a rich array of awards, recognising the remarkable contribution he'd made as an Australian, as an Aboriginal man and as a musician. In 2011, he was one of the first people inducted to the Victorian Aboriginal Honour Roll. In 2015, he was honoured in the Queen's Birthday Honours List as a member of the Order of Australia for services to music as a singer-songwriter, a guitarist and an activist for social justice. In 2020, he was named the 2020 Victorian Australian of the Year. Amongst the other nominations and awards he received, there was a Deadly Award for a lifetime contribution to healing the stolen generations in 2013 at the 2020 ARIA Music Awards, held on 25 November 2020. Archie Roach was inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame. Archie Roach contributed in a range of ways going beyond his extraordinary musical contribution. The establishment of the Archie Roach Foundation was intended to nurture meaningful and potentially life-changing opportunities for First Nations artists. And Archie Roach wrote this in the statement for the Foundation, quotes, "The Foundation is a way for me to give back and pass on what's been given to me from people I've met on my journey who have pointed me in a different direction to a better way of life and understanding, to freedom." Apart from being a musician and author, Archie worked in a range of jobs throughout his life and, of course, brought to bear that very diverse experience in his music. At different times, he worked as a drug and alcohol counsellor, floral arranging, salt shovelling, blacksmithing, working in an abattoir, and even a short period as a tent boxer. He's collaborated with a long list of great musicians and artists, including Paul Simon, Bangarra Dance Theatre, Paul Kelly, David Bridie, Jimmy Barnes, Paul Grabowski, and the Australian Art Orchestra. And he's toured extensively throughout the US, Canada, the UK and Europe with artists of the stature of Bob Dylan, Billy Bragg, Tracy Chapman, Suzanne Vega, Patti Smith and Joan Armatrading. In his 2019 memoir entitled "Tell Me Why, The Story of My Life and My Music," Archie Roach told Australians about many aspects of his life in a very raw and authentic way. His memoir was awarded the Victorian Premier's Literary Award in February 2021. In his acceptance speech, he had this to say, quotes, "We need to understand and write about the First Peoples' experience in history, as well as migrants' experiences, because they're both connected, they're intertwined." And that is a powerful insight, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Archie Roach enjoyed tremendous success in his artistic career, but throughout his times of great success, he never forgot the challenges he'd experienced at different times of his life. And he was known for his humility, for his sense of generosity, and even as his health deteriorated, he continued to perform, particularly for Aboriginal audiences. A distinctive feature of Archie Roach's approach was that despite the traumas that he'd experienced, he lived his life with hope, and that informed his approach as a storyteller and as a truth teller. He had this to say, quotes, "You can reach the darkest point in your life and come back, and come good, even better," close quote. So using his art, using his music to tell stories of very difficult times for him and others, but also sending a message of hope. As he once said, quote, "Songs outlive people," and his body of work, the songs that he wrote, the songs that he performed, are a profound legacy that he leaves to all Australians, together with the inspiration of the way he carried out his life and work. I join with other members of this House in expressing deep condolences to Archie's family and friends, particularly his sons Amos and Ebone, and foster children Chris, Arthur and Terence. And I close by joining with many other members in acknowledging the extraordinary life and contribution of Archie Roach, in recognising his remarkable talent and in thanking him for the truth-telling and the message of hope that he sent to Indigenous Australians and that he sent to all Australians.
And I give the call to the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, this morning, in preparation for this speech, I read the lyrics of "Took the Children Away." And it's a song I know well, as I know that most people in this place and around our country know well. But as I started reading it this morning, of course, I started crying. And such is the power of Archie Roach's work, that a song so well known, so often played and heard, still moves me to tears. And I know I would not be alone in that. Archie Roach was a powerful storyteller and musician. He told his story, and in doing so, he also told our country parts of its story that we too often wanted to ignore. He did this with beauty, with dignity, and with vulnerability. And he invited all of us, not just to share the sorrow and the horror of that story, but also the strength and the opportunity, which is such a remarkable combination and achievement, to be able to put together that life, which included a lot of pain and suffering being inflicted upon him, with the opportunity to also see the strength and the dignity and the opportunity for change. It takes a remarkable man to be able to use that trauma as the starting point for strength, outreach, and ultimately change. And coming back to where I began, the last words of "took the children away" are "the children came back. Yes, I came back." Words of hope, words of strength, words of a potential future, a way forward for our country from the hurt and from the trauma. And it speaks also to the importance for Archie Roach and for his community of his country, of his people, of coming back to those people and to that country. Archie Roach was a proud Gunditjmara and Bundjalung man, and I extend my deepest sympathies to all of his family and his community mourning his passing. Please know that our country grieves with you and that we feel privileged that we were also able to share his story, to hear his music, and also through him to be moved to work for change. Deputy Speaker, I had the privilege of seeing Archie Roach perform a number of times, including performances with his great love, Ruby Hunter. And every single one of those performances was a special occasion. You always knew when Archie had his guitar, when he was on the stage, that something beautiful was about to come, that something moving was about to come, and that something powerful was about to come. And one of the reasons I was privileged enough to see Archie Roach perform so many times is because his and Ruby's story was also very much a Victorian and a Melbourne story. So much of it was set around Fitzroy, and as the title of Archie's album makes clear, Charcoal Lane. He wrote about the places where his life happened. He wrote about his country, but he also wrote about the Melbourne streets where his story played out. And I also know from many of the tributes that have been paid to him that him telling that story about what his life was like on those Melbourne streets has helped many a young First Nations person in Melbourne and Victoria to understand where their strength lies, to understand what a better future can look for them. And that is a remarkable legacy. Archie Roach's impact on Australian music is clear from the many tributes he's received from our musicians, from Paul Kelly, who he performed with, to more recent musicians such as Briggs, who in his tribute rightly said, "Being the greatest means you transcended the genre, and what you do impacts culture. You change culture around the world. You change the discussion." This is what Archie Roach did. He changed culture and he changed lives. It is a remarkable gift and a remarkable legacy. Thank you, Archie Roach, for sharing your story, your gift and your life with us. We will all miss you, but we are so grateful for having had you.
The question is that the address be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I never had the honour of meeting Archie Roach, musician, storyteller, and a voice for Indigenous people. However, Archie Roach grew up and spent a significant part of his young life in Casey. And today I want to pay tribute to Archie and share more of his story in Casey. Archie Roach was inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame in 2020 after 30 years on the Australian music scene. He had a profound impact on our country that goes well beyond the power of his music. As a member of the Stolen Generations, Roach put his deeply personal stories to music and became an advocate for Indigenous Australians, giving a voice to others that had experienced the same pain of being removed from family and country. The Gunditjmara Burrajong Senior Elder was born in Mooroopna, near Shepparton in Victoria, but was removed from his family when he was 3. He experienced several years of unstable foster conditions until being settled with his foster parents, Alex and Dulcie Cox, a family of Scottish immigrants living in Mount Evelyn and later in Mooroopna, in my electorate of Casey. His foster sister, Mary Cox, would sing church hymns and taught Archie guitar and piano. His love of music was inspired by Alex's collection of Scottish music. Archie once said about his foster father, "He was a big influence on me, a good influence. I'll love him to the day I die." In an interview with our local paper, The Star Mail, last May, in the lead-up to his memoir tour, Tell Me Why, Roach spoke of his early years growing up in Casey. He spent holidays in his foster family's shack in the gum forests of Mount Evelyn, a beautiful and inspiring place. He later lived in Mooroopna and attended Lilydale High School, a place where he had fond memories. He said that he had great friends at Lilydale High, friends he really cared about. I like to think about him finding joy in the same place I spent many happier childhood. The environment is beautiful, as are the people. In 1970, while in class at Lilydale High, Roach received a letter from his sister Myrtle informing him his biological mother Nellie had died. It was this letter that sent him on a journey to find the truth about his origins and life as an Aboriginal man, leading to some of his most poignant and well-known songs, like Took the Children Away. Archie Roach will be remembered for his unwavering desire to share the stories of Aboriginal people, his iconic voice, and his musical capabilities. Roach was meant to perform in Healesville this weekend. His music will live on in the many communities he made better, including ours in Casey. I would like to share, as everyone has, my condolences to his family and friends, and particularly his sons, Amos and Iban.
Are there any statements? And I call the honourable member for Kingsford Smith.
Thanks, Speaker. Vale Archie Roach. Australia and the music world has lost a legend, and I want to extend my deepest sympathies to Archie's family. Archibald William Roach, AM, showed that music matters to who we are as a nation, and that songs are as much about the stories that we tell of ourselves and to others across the land. Deeply personal stories of how they took the children away, of how a 2-year-old Archie was forcibly taken from his mum, dad and family at the Framlingham Aboriginal Mission in southwest Victoria. Songs that speak of a bit of truth, but also celebrate the enduring love and the sweetness of a family reunion. It's a song of the stolen generations, but also a story of our nation. When the song was performed for the first time amidst the protests at the bicentenary celebrations in 1988, His performance to a mainly white audience at the time, Speaker, was first met with stunned silence. But the applause that followed and the acclaim that grew throughout Archie's musical career showed the transformative power of art. For all that was taken from Archie and so many others, it was the gift of his songs that we are so grateful for. He will be remembered as one of the early Aboriginal artists to bring First Nations music into the mainstream, and he really did set the pace and inspire others like Yothu Yindi and other great First Nations artists to sing their songs of their heritage and their culture. And his mentoring and nurturing of the next generation of storytellers is also part of his great legacy and his gift to this nation. It showed how revered Archie was by contemporary artists and how relevant his message is today. If anyone had cause to be bitter or angry with the card that life had dealt them, it was Archie Roach. But he never lived his life with that anger, with that bitterness, with that regret. His life and his songs were a message of forgiveness, of compassion, of love, but more importantly, of the power of looking ahead to the future, to a brighter future, while telling the truth of the darkness of the past. His death is a huge loss for our nation, and Archie's songs will live on forever, and those truths that he spoke of will always be part of the Australian story. Rest in peace, Archie Roach.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now be adjourned.
I second that motion.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. on Thursday, the 4th of August 2022.
Well done, Sal.